If you're beginning this year in a coffee shop, staring at maps, saying, someday I'll go there, then we are inviting you on an adventure to leave your life behind and join him in his work.
He came to bring light where there was darkness, so that rather than you're just hearing that God loves you, you could see that he loved you. The beauty of grace is that Jesus doesn't ask us to pay him back. He just asks us to pay it forward.
He has given us the power to speak life and to speak death into the world around us by using our words. Our words are a much more powerful tool than most of us ever realize.
We have an obligation to share the good news of Jesus with every single person who we come in contact with.
We can be a sanctuary, that we can be a light, that this is a place of hope, that this is a place where the ground should be level.
It gives me great pleasure to tell you that our next multi-site campus location will be in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And
God wasn't nominated, he wasn't appointed, he wasn't elected, so he can't be impeached and he will not be voted out of office. You can't control him, you can't label him, you can't confine him. He sits enthroned in heaven, so you can't restrain his will.
Your past is forgiven. Your failures are not final. Regret is not the last word in any story that God writes. The resurrection changes everything. It gives us hope. You see, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is irrefutable. The prophecies are undeniable. The facts are indisputable. The implications are inconceivable.
Well, every year at this service, the one right after Christmas, the campus pastors get the opportunity to speak. And so instead of watching Dave or Kyle on a screen, we get the opportunity to speak live right here, which is one thing that we love to do. In the past 2 years, I have done this myself. And this year I was thinking, you know what? It would be good to do something a little bit different. And so I asked Stephen Puricelli, our connections pastor, if he would be willing to speak as well. And my motivation was a couple of different things. You know, one is being that there's the Christmas holiday right beforehand. I know how I have a tendency to procrastinate on things. Stephen is very organized, gets things done up ahead of time. And so I was like, you know, if I ask Steve, he will make sure that I'm getting my stuff done on time so that we're ready to go and I'm not running around like crazy. Also, he is the connections pastor here, which means that he has, for largely those of you who became members of this church, you worked with Stephen in that process. He was calling you, reminding you of different things, starting point, and all those different things, and was helping you just find different areas and different places to serve. And then also, he's a great communicator, and I think it would be worth for you to hear from him this morning. And so I was just excited just to be able to have him come up here and do this. This morning, we're talking about a better way to compare. A better way to compare or comparison. And you know, when it comes to comparing things, we compare pretty much everything from an early age all the way through life. We compare how smart we are, our athletic ability. We compare the size of our home. We compare the value of our car or the type of car. We compare clothing. We compare looks. We compare talents, and we compare gifting. We compare, anything you think of. We compare our significant other, and you know that's why you call them a trophy wife. It's because you are comparing them to other people. We compare our wives. We compare how we raise our children. It's amazing how many people get on Facebook and write, I saw this mom today at Walmart. Because we're comparing how they raise their kids. And so you name it, we compare it. This past week, I was in Kansas with my family, with my in-laws, and we go there every single year. And you know, when you're in Kansas, the thing that you do is you take in countless worthless hours of Hallmark Christmas specials. And I'm just going to be honest with you, there's nothing that compares to the misery of that. It is awful. And so anyway, we were doing our family Christmas, and everyone was getting their gift, and they were receiving them one at a time, and everyone was watching as the one person opens their gift for everyone to see it. Say, ooh, you're going to love that, But the interesting thing about gift giving is it is incredibly stressful. And it's stressful when you are the one who you are buying gifts because you go out and you don't want to buy something that's going to make you look cheap to the in-laws or to the rest of the family. But also, you also know there's only a limited amount of money that I can actually spend on this. And so I don't want to spend too much money because, well, I don't want to go broke. And so there's this really weird balance that you're trying to strike when it comes to gift giving. And you know that as you are giving out your gifts, you aren't the only person who is paying attention to what is giving. I mean, every kid is counting how many packages they were able to open versus the other cousins that were opening gifts. And every parent is calculating the dollars that were spent on their kid versus the dollars that they spent on somebody else's kid. It's incredibly stressful. And here's what we know, is that because of comparison, it runs the risk of robbing us of the joy of gift giving. And each year, at my wife's house, her parents do this thing that they've done for years and years and years. They have this Christmas tree, and on the Christmas tree, there are these little mailboxes with their name of their children that are on there. And each year, her parents will take and they put a certain sum of money into that mailbox, and it's the same amount every single year, into that mailbox, and they'll hide it amongst all the hundreds of ornaments that are on the tree. And I decided this year to do a little experiment. What would happen if I put roughly double the amount of money in my wife's mailbox versus everybody else? And I thought, this is a great idea, right? You just think these ideas, you think this is going to be great. And so I take, and no one's paying attention. I walk over, I find her mailbox, I open it up, and I put, double the amount of money in there, and I close it up, hoping no one will notice. Well, it comes time for them, everybody's getting their stocking, and then it's like, okay, her sister and her brother and all of them, go get your mailboxes. And so they go around the tree, and they're all looking around. They're like, I found mine, and they pull it out. And my wife opens hers up, and I'm watching the whole thing like with this great anticipation. And I'm watching it, and she opens hers up, and she pulls out the first amount of money and looks at it, and she looks in there, and there's more, and she pulls out, and she quickly just puts it in her pocket. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh, yeah, this is great. And so I looked at her, I said, how much money did you get? And she looked at me, and her face was just white, and like you could tell she was bothered, and she said, too much. And I was like, oh yeah, I bet you did, So I'm sitting there, and so then I go to her brother, I said, hey, you need to ask Leanne how much money she got in her mailbox. And he said, why? And I said, because I put a lot more in there than what you all got. He's like, oh, he thinks it's great. He's right in there with me. He says, hey, sis, how much money did you get? Or first he asked Jeanette, how much money did you get? And she's like, I got, and she said the amount. Hey, sis, how much money did you get in hers? True. She says, the same as you. Like she wisely says, I'm not going to say, and I'm sitting, and he's like, really? Well, how much was that? And she, it's the same thing. I got the same thing that you got. And he's like, oh yeah. And then she looks over at me like you could tell she's bothered by this. And I'm laughing hard. Like, I'm like, oh, one, she just lied. And secondly, she knows this isn't right. And she sees me and he goes, really? Is that what you got? And he's like giggling about it. And she said, Bo, I can't help it if I'm the favorite. Which that isn't normally like my wife. After 20 years of being married to me, she's finally picked up on my sarcasm.
Yeah, well, the Bible actually has a lot to say about comparison. And coming out of the holiday and Christmas giving season, we've all kind of been in James's shoes and experienced that. And we're going to look at a parable from Matthew chapter 25 today. And a parable of Jesus is a made-up story that Jesus just kind of made up to illustrate a true point. And so we're going to read one. I'm going to read it for you. It's a little bit longer, but I just want you to follow along. And many of you are going to recognize it. It comes from Matthew chapter 25. It says this again. It says, again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who had received 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who had received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, their master returned from his trip, and he called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and here I have earned 5 more. The master was full of praise. Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together. The servant who had received the 2 bags of silver came forward and said, Master, you gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more. The master said, well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, So now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." Then the servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here is your money back." But the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it." And then he ordered, "Take the money from the servant and give it to the one with 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth."
You know, it'd be easy for us to see how these 3 guys responded. Like, you know, if I would have been there, I would have been looking and saying, "Well, I want to know why. Why did the one guy get 5? And why did that guy get 2? And why did I only get 1?" And so you could see how comparison would easily fit in to the story. And see, it's comparison is dependent upon this. It's dependent upon a perceived standard of fairness or equality or consistency. And it's all of those things are determined by each individual who sees it as this is fair and this is equal, and that's what they do. And so here's an example. If I were to give my 12-year-old son $20 to spend, and then I gave my 3-year-old, if I had a 3-year-old, 50 cents to spend, some people would look at that and say, "Well, that's not fair. You gave one a lot more money than you gave the other." And they would just be like, that doesn't make sense. However, when I look at it from my perspective, I look at it and I say, no, it's complete fairness. It makes absolute sense because I gave it according to the one that I could trust, how much they earn, how much they could be responsible with. And so that is why I imparted the $20 to one and the 50 cents to another. And so that makes sense. But it's according to a standard that I have established myself, not a standard that is a universal standard. Stephen, you and I, we work out at a gym on a pretty consistent basis. It hasn't been very consistent over the last month, but we'll get back to it, I promise. And that's why we gave you donuts this morning, make you feel the way I do. And so, however, God has given us, you and I, 2 completely different bodies, not just literally, but just the way that we physically look. And we both do cardio on a treadmill together at the gym, and then we lift weights.
I need to pause, James, there, because I don't know if you can classify what you do on the treadmill as cardio. You walk. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, but you walk on the treadmill is all you really do. I'm running, and you're walking.
It is a fast-paced motion that is on an uphill incline, So I would perceive it as cardio, and, I would say physically it probably does the same thing as running. I mean, it's fast-paced. And so, and the thing I keep pointing out to him all the time, he reminds me of this all the time. "You just going to walk today?" And I'm like, it's fast-paced, uphill incline movement, good for burning fat. And so anyhow, but we have these conversations, and I say, "Hey, you know what, here's the deal. You can say that you're running, but if you were that fast, why do I never lose sight of you? You're always still right there." And not only that, but when we get off, when we are finished, you and I both finish literally at the exact same place at the exact same time. So talk about how fast you're going. The way I see it, we're moving at the same pace. I mean, right? I mean, that's the way I see it. So, but we are actually different. Stephen is a much better runner than I am.
I need to pause once again. You don't run, okay? So literally anyone in here that's ever run is a faster runner than James because he walks.
Well, we can agree on this. I am better at lifting weights.
Yeah, if you've been on staff any length of time, we all have kind of these, you're just kind of a good motivational quote person for some of us. And I got a quote up here. I just want to share with you just put it up here. This is a great quote from James Hauser. It says, "It's crazy how much you work out but are still so weak." I mean, it's just really been like a life quote that I've tried to live by. So thank you for that.
It really is a great quote. Here's for those of us who understand about athletic ability and running, what I would say is that was actually encouragement. You see, what I'm saying to him is it takes great discipline and consistency and grit to come in day after day and to work out as hard as you work out and yet see such little improvement, And so man, I'm speaking to your character when I'm talking about that. But the reality is this, is that Stephen and I, we both have different bodies, so comparing them is actually silly. I will never be a good runner, and Stephen, he will never be strong.
I don't know how to... And so really what we're going to do is going to be a little bit of advice about comparison. And our first piece of advice, this is cool. It's terrible advice. And what's great about it is it's bad advice if you're a Christian or not a Christian. This is great. So this is just bad advice all the way around. A bad way to live is to compare yourself to others. Compare yourself, unless you want to be miserable. If you want to be miserable, this is a great way to live. But, comparison is just a bad way to live, to compare you to anyone else. I was thinking about this as we were preparing this message about how easy, there's been no other time in history has it been so easy to make comparisons as it is right now. It's in your face all the time on social media and Facebook. Right away, you can be like, how many likes did they get on that? And you look at your last one, and you compare likes and comments and all those different things. You can get on Zillow when, a friend buys a new house and get the Zestimate and try and make a comparison of how they're able to afford that or how big is that house. It doesn't seem that big on its way. You can do that. You can Google the price of a car when a neighbor shows up with a new car, and you just kind of Google it because you're really curious about it. It has never been easier for us to make comparisons to other people. One of the things I was thinking about is, one of the things I've never witnessed is someone coming up to me, and saying, man, I'm totally just regret how patient we've been in our financial life. I regret waiting to buy that till we were absolutely sure we could afford it. I really regret ignoring what everyone else is doing and how they're spending their money and just staying patient with how. They don't say that. What we do here is the exact opposite. Man, I regret getting jealous and comparing. I regret buying that thing that I couldn't afford to impress the person that I don't even like. I regret that. I came across a quote when I was preparing from Jim Carrey, the comedian. He says this. He goes, I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they've ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer. So there's a guy who has way more fame, way more fortune than all of us probably will ever have. And he's at the end of that looking back, and he's sitting there telling you, I wish you could see it from my angle. The thing that you think you want, that you think you're going to pursue, I wish you could see it from my end because it's nothing. You are who you are. And so because we make all these comparisons, eventually you will feel slighted by God. You will feel slighted like, God, why did you make me like me? Why didn't you make me like them? I think I'm more of a 10 bag of silver kind of guy, but you've only given me 1 bag of silver. In the Bible, it has so much to say about comparison.
Yeah, one of the places that we find about comparison is the Book of Proverbs, and there are several passages in there, but Proverbs 14:30 says this, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. When we're envious of other people. In John chapter 21, there's a story between Peter and Jesus, one of my favorites in Scripture because it allows us to have a snapshot into a conversation that Peter and Jesus were actually having that humanizes who they are. And Peter was sitting there, and Jesus had just asked him while they're sitting together, he said, hey, Peter, do you love me? And he said, yes. And they went through this 3 times. And at the end of it, I think Peter was probably feeling pretty good, like Jesus knows that I love him. We're good for my past. Everything's great. And then Jesus, and then Peter's probably thinking, hey, my future is also going to be pretty bright as well. I mean, after all, I'm sitting down having a conversation with a guy who just rose from the dead. And he's known as being the king. And so Peter's probably thinking, my future being friends with this guy who can overcome death is pretty good. I'm in a good place. And then Jesus drops this bombshell in a conversation and says, and now, Peter, I want to tell you the kind of death that you're going to have. He says, when you are older, what's going to happen is you aren't going to be able to dress yourself. And there are going to be people who are going to take you to places that you don't want to go. And it was signifying that Peter was going to die a death, and he was going to suffer in this. And Peter is sitting there just thinking, well, this isn't good news. This isn't what I want to hear. And he starts to look around when life gets, starts weighing down on you and bad things happen. You hear bad news. You start to look around. You start to ask questions. And he's looking at the other disciples who are there. And he looks over and he sees John sitting there. And John is known as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He is the disciple that the other disciples have said, well, we're all pretty much the same, but Jesus really loves John. John is his favorite. And so he looks over at John and looks back at Jesus and he says, Jesus, what's going to happen to him? Is he going to suffer like me? Is his life going to end like mine? And Jesus says to Peter, he says, Peter, stop comparing yourself to other people. Stop worrying about how their life is going to be. As for you, you follow me.
You know, anytime you end up comparing yourself to someone else, it always ends up in a competition. You always end up competing. And anytime there's a competition, there's always a winner and there's always a loser. And a comparison competition always damages relationships every single time. So if you want to ruin a relationship, and if that's your goal, the best way to do it is just to start comparing anything. This will ruin relationships with your spouse, with your children, and with your coworkers. Start comparing anything, like how often you do the dishes, who folded the laundry last, who picks up the kids more, how much money was spent, how much money was made, how much money was saved, square footage, office size, office location, job title. You just find something you want to compare, and then you can reap the reward of a ruined relationship. Obviously, this is a bad way to live. You know, one of the things I love finding out is when the Bible says something first, or Jesus says something first, and then science discovers it later a little bit. And there's research all about how making these comparisons is an unhealthy way to live. I came across an article from Forbes written by a lady named Alice Walton, and she says this, and I'm just going to read a portion of it to you. It says this: "The irony of Facebook is by now known to most. The social network has been linked to a surprising number of undesirable mental health consequences: depression, low self-esteem, and bitter jealousy among them. Now, a new study in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology finds that Facebook and depressive symptoms go hand in hand. They call it social comparison. That is, making comparisons often between our most humdrum moments and our friends' highlight reels. This is what links Facebook time and depressive symptoms together. In the new study from the University of Houston, it turned out that people who used Facebook more tended to have more depressive symptoms. I'll say it again. Modern research is just validating what you and I already know. It's validating what the Bible said first, that comparison will ruin your relationships with your marriage, with your coworkers, and with your children. You know, an example about the bags of silver, the guy that only had one bag of silver made a comparison to the guy with 5 and the guy with more than him. And it ruined his relationship with them. It ruined his relationship with his master, and it ultimately cost him his job. In the Old Testament book of Genesis, there's a story about 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. Many of you know the story is that about Cain. Cain was a farmer, and Cain presented some of his crops before the Lord as a sacrifice. His brother Abel did the same thing, but he was a shepherd, and he presented the best portions of his firstborn lambs before the Lord. Well, God accepted Abel's gift because it was the first and best that Abel had to offer before the Lord. But he rejected Cain's gift because Cain gave the leftovers, the left behind, the part that wasn't from the top of his crop. And so Cain burned with envy for his brother Abel. He compared his relationship with God to his brother's relationship with God. And many of you know the story about how it ended. The first murder in the Bible, Cain kills his brother Abel because of a comparison, because he saw his brother had something he wanted that he didn't have, and so he murdered them. Now, you probably haven't murdered someone over a comparison, but you probably have murdered a few relationships because of comparison. So here's the thing. Anytime you compare, you end up competing, and anytime you end up competing, every single time, it ultimately costs you to lose. So this is a bad way to live. A bad way to live is to compare yourself to others. Theodore Roosevelt said this. He said, "Comparison is the thief of joy," and it's true.
And so comparing ourselves to others it is a bad way to live. And so there must be a better way to live, and that is to compare yourself to yourself. When you do that, it's just a better way to do it. Now, the reality is this is true whether you are a Christian or non-Christian, whether you follow Jesus or not, whether you think the principles in the Bible are true or not. This is sort of a universal, both Christian and secular principle to an extent. And so, you can hear this and think, hey, this is a better way to live. I shouldn't compare myself to others. A better way for me to live is to compare myself to myself. If you think about it, when I compare myself to other people, if you're anything like me, I will compare myself to people who aren't as good as I am in a particular area. Someone who isn't as strong as me, or somebody, who maybe doesn't have as much money, or somebody who's not as gifted or talented. But I never compare myself to people who are better than I am because, I do that because I want to feel better about myself, which leads to pride. And so I compare to people who are inferior. On the flip side, sometimes what we do is we will make comparisons to people who have it better than I am, who are more gifted or more talented than we are. And when we do that, what happens is we find that these people are superior in these areas. And when that happens, we feel a little bit down and depressed. And so what that does is that leads us to resentment. And so when I compare downward to people, it leads to pride. And when I compare upward to people, it leads to resentment. You see, comparing myself to myself is a better way to live. You've probably heard this before. There are hundreds of articles, blogs, books written about this. And the question that is asked is this: am I better today than I was yesterday? And my goal is to be better today than I was yesterday. And there are thousands of things that are written on this. And so we think about that. Am I better today? Am I building upon what I did yesterday and becoming better at it? And so you think about it like this. If I compare myself to others, I end up usually becoming bitter. But when I compare myself to myself, I usually will become better.
You know, this fall, if you talk to me like at all at any point, you would quickly learn I was training for a marathon, my first marathon. If you ask my wife, apparently that's all I talked about, so I'm sorry to all of you that had to endure that. And it's a difficult task prepping for a marathon. I mean, it's all consuming, and you're all into it. There's a lot of stuff that goes into just even getting ready.
You know, I feel like all that training you did with me on a treadmill helped you complete that marathon.
Actually, it didn't, because I never walked when I ran my marathon, so I don't think it was that helpful. But finally, in early November, I ran the race in Indianapolis with like 19,000 other runners. And one of the weird things about running the race is it's like a scene. Like, you've got people out there running in costumes, and it's just bizarre what they'll do. You're running through college universities, and so there's drunken students like encouraging you, and that's strangely helpful. And people in yards, they hand out stuff to you like candy and chocolate and bacon. I don't know why people hand out bacon. It was the week before the election, so the number of political signs was staggering, and they were all like so funny, just so inappropriate. I can't share them with you today. And but really, one of the interesting things about running a marathon is you're constantly with thousands of runners. You're constantly being passed by someone, or you're passing another person. It's always going on. But I'm never comparing or competing with those around me. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not there to win the race. I'm there to compete within myself. So the only thing I cared about was what my watch was telling me, because I knew the pace I had to run, and I knew where my splits need to be. Like, I was trying to run an under 4-hour marathon, and I knew I had to finish the halfway point in 1 hour and 56 minutes, and I did in 1 hour and 54 minutes, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. And I finally finished my race in 3 hours and 57 minutes, 3 minutes ahead of my goal. I mean, it was razor. I wasn't expecting that. That's really not that impressive. Anyway.
Thanks to me.
But there is no better feeling when you cross the finish line, meeting the goal. I did the best that I could do for me. I mean, that was such a good feeling. Off to my left, my wife and family, they were all there cheering me on. And another guy from this campus, also named Steven, was there, and he had finished like way ahead of me, was waiting for me to finish and cheering me on. And he came up after and he said, "Hey, you met your goal. Way to go. Congratulations." And I was excited. But here's the thing. In that moment, I could have gotten down. If I would have made a comparison with how he finished, because he's so much faster, I could have walked away depressed. But here's the thing. I'm never going to be as fast as him. God gave him like 10 bags of silver in the running world, and I've just got a couple bags of silver of running over there, if that makes any sense, is that I should never make a comparison to him. I am me, and the best way for me to live is do the best version of me. In Galatians chapter 6, it says this. It says, "Pay careful attention to your own work, for then you will get satisfaction of a job well done, and you won't need to compare yourself to anyone else. For we each are responsible for our own conduct." If I wasted my time comparing myself to the other runner, I would have missed the joy of being the best version that God had made me to be. I did the best that I could given what God had given me. I'd love to be able to sing, but I'm a terrible singer. And so that's never going to happen. I would love to be as strong as James, but I'm weak. It's not going to happen. I'll never be as strong. I would love to have one of the most brilliant minds, like the doctors, and that's not me. I am Stephen. And so what I need to be is the best version that God has made me to be and that God has called me to be. Because when I get within my body and my skin and who I've been created to be, I'll contribute more to the kingdom of God and to his glory.
You know, Bill Gates said this. He said, "Don't compare yourself to anyone in this world. And if you do so, you are insulting yourself." And it's interesting. I think Bill has stumbled onto something here without even realizing. And I think when this phrase was said, he was probably talking about comparing ourselves to other people and how that is a bad idea. But there is also great danger if the only thing we ever do is compare myself to myself. Because improvement still needs to be had. And in order for improvement to be had, somebody has to determine what is best or what is better. Someone still has to say, hey, this is your new goal. This is your new standard. This is your purpose for life. This is what your best life looks like. This is what it looks like. And there's an article which I read not too long ago that talked about the American dream. And in this article, they were talking about how the American dream has actually shifted. It used to be the goal, the ideal was family and faith. Family and faith. So everything you did was improvement for your family and for faith. But they said there's been this shift, and the shift now is the American dream is fame and fortune. The people are doing everything they can to be famous and to have lots of money. And that has become the goal. And so what you see is that people's personal standards, they change because you determine your own, like if it never leaves outside of me and it's me comparing myself to me, then I'm the one who's going to determine what is best or what is better. And it never leaves that. And so those things can and they do change. It could go from running a marathon, for instance. You might run a marathon, that's your goal, to at some point in life, marathon becomes a little bit too difficult. And so now it's to run a mini. Or maybe it's like me where your goal is to walk a mile uphill and eventually, probably sometime in the near future, it'll just be getting out of bed.
You know, so comparing yourself to you is a good way to live, but ultimately it's not the best way to live. The best way to live is to compare yourself to Jesus. And I know you can make fun of me because that's, kind of obvious as where we're going. But if you call yourself a Christian, this isn't an option for you because we take our cues for how to live as Christ followers from how he first lived. There's a staff trainer we have at Southeast named Dan Spader, and he shared this quote with us one time, and it's always stuck with me. It's sort of unlocked a way for me to view Jesus and better understand who Jesus was. It comes from Charles Ryrie, and it says this. It says, "Never less than God, he," that's Jesus, "chose to live his life, never more than a man." For the longest time, I kind of viewed Jesus. Like if you think back to your school days, I used to be a high school math teacher. I kind of viewed Jesus, remember when the principal would come into the classroom and sort of sit in the corner of the classroom and scowl at everyone? And then all of a sudden the room would change, like students were suddenly sitting up straight and paying attention and raising their hand before they were talking. They're suddenly asking follow-up questions to whatever you were teaching about. They were suddenly very engaged and interested. And the teacher, they're very helpful, more so than usual, and on their A game and have their best lesson prepared. And I kind of viewed Jesus in that same light. Like I kind of viewed Jesus as the principal coming in to check on us. And one of the things I've realized is that is not what Jesus was. Jesus wasn't coming in the power and the authority of a teacher or of a principal checking in on a teacher. Charles Ryrie, remember, he says, "Never less than God. He chose to live his life, never more than a man." Jesus came into the world in the power and presence of us, without the authority. He was born to a very poor family and poor circumstances. It even says in the Bible, Jesus was the song of the drunkards. I mean, think about that. We just talked about this with Christmas. Mary and Joseph got married, and Mary was pregnant with Jesus, but it wasn't Joseph's kids. And it says the songs of the drunkards were about who Jesus' real daddy could be, not realizing that it was actually from God. He wasn't a principal coming in to check in on us. Jesus came to be like us in every way. He lived like us, to love us, to save us, and to offer his life in exchange for our life, and to set an example for us. We can compare our lives to his life because he came like us. Jesus was God in the flesh. Like if God were to take on human form, he would look like Jesus.
In our home, we have one of those over-the-door basketball goals. I'm sure you've seen them before. And my boys play on that thing nonstop. I mean, all the time at night, we have to tell them, okay, no more basketball, because they're constantly playing basketball. But they don't just shoot baskets. they are imagining the whole time, and they are audibly calling out what's happening in the game that they are participating in it. And I can tell you that one thing that has never, ever happened in our home, they have never imagined themselves being me. Like, never. Like, I'm like, come on, man. And so I was good at one time, when I could run. And so, but they never do that. And so what they do is you hear them in there, it'd be awesome if they would just one time say, and James Hauser has his defender at the top of the key. He crosses him over. He drives the lane. He jumps up. He dunks it. He's fouled. He's going to the line to shoot one to win the game. No. It's always like Westbrook or Curry or LeBron, who are those guys? And so, it's always those guys because the reality is they imagine the best. When I was a kid, I never imagined my dad. I always imagined, probably similar to you, that I was Michael Jordan, I could jump from the free throw line. That's who I imagined because we imagine the best, and so we idolize those who that we think are the best and that we want to be like. We start wearing their jersey. We start wearing their hats. We start talking like them. We start paying stupid prices for their shoe. We bear the image of what we worship. That's what we do. We bear the image of what we worship. And the book of Genesis says that we were all made, every human being was made in the image of God. And so the question is, if we were made in the image of God, what exactly does that look like for us? Because there do seem to be some differences. And the answer is, it would look like Jesus. It would look like Jesus because Jesus is the picture of perfection for us on this earth. And if we are going to compare, it is best for us to compare ourselves to Jesus. Because like the Apostle Paul said, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God. He is the image. He is the example of the invisible God for us. And so I should compare to him. And I shouldn't ask just the question, hey, am I better than who I was yesterday? I should ask the question, am I becoming more like Jesus today?
And Jesus is the reason we have a victory weekend to even celebrate. He's the whole reason we can live for those of us that are Christ followers. And here's the thing, we can compare our lives to his life. And here's the reason why we can. There's no comparison. We can compare our life to Jesus because there's no competition. The battle's already over. It's been won. Like sin has been defeated. And so we can compare to him because he already has obtained the victory with sin being defeated. When we compare ourselves to others or to ourselves, we are comparing flesh on flesh. But with Jesus, we can compare ourselves to him because he's already won the battle. Today we celebrate that victory in that life. You will never experience a more truthful joy if you're spending your whole time comparing your life to those around you. There's never going to be a victory in comparison like that. But there is a victory because through Jesus, we take on his identity, and with that, there's no reason to compare.